The Posner Center, where Chinook Fund's office is located, sits on Cheyenne and Arapaho land, who are the original stewards of this land. We acknowledge all other indigenous tribes and nations who call Colorado home, which include Apache, Shoshone, Ute, Pueblo, Pawnee Comanche, Kiowa, Zuni, and Navajo. 48 tribes have called this land home. We recognize that US public policy has been used to displace indigenous communities, erode tribal nation sovereignty, and forcibly assimilate Native individuals into US society. We acknowledge the labor of enslaved Africans and their descendants who worked this stolen land for the colonists and who continue to disproportionately face economic oppression, racism, violence, and exploitation. We share this acknowledgement to encourage all of us here to consider how our work in this space and in our daily lives can address these historic and contemporary atrocities perpetuated against Native people and other marginalized communities. We invite everyone in this space to recognize their ancestors and the forces of history that brought you here, as well as the work you are engaged in to support our collective liberation and the liberation of future generations. Thank you. We'll now have a minute of silence to honor the victims of AAPI violence, not just recently, but throughout history. So I'll start that now. Thank you, everyone. My name is Jess Wetzel. I am a Giving Project alumni member and one of the alumni community co-chairs. And I'm going to be kicking us off this morning just with a introduction of the panelists and our moderator as well. We'll introduce Chinook Fund, and I'll turn that over to Kai Hamilton, who's another alumni co-chair. And then our moderator, who I will introduce in a moment, will come on with a history and context of Asian Pacific Americans and, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the US. And then we'll have our panel conversation. There will be time afterwards for question and answer from the audience. And then we'll close with a spoken word performance by Kimberly Ming. So first, I will start by introducing our moderator and facilitator, who is Brian Jan. So Brian is one of the Giving Project alumni community co-chairs as well. He was part of the spring 2021 cohort. He is a team lead at Ping Identity, which is a software company based out of Denver. And he is currently pursuing his master's degree in public policy at the University of Chicago. I don't know if you want to wave, Brian, so everyone knows who you are. Good to see you. All right. So now I'll introduce our panelists. So our first panelist here is Harry Budisidharta. He is the executive director of the Asian Pacific Development Center, which is a community-based organization founded in 1980 to serve the Asian American and Pacific Islander population throughout Colorado. He has received numerous awards for his commitment to community service and advocacy work. Thank you so much for being here with us, Harry. Next, I'm pleased to introduce Noreen Singh. Noreen is a community organizer and youth mentor at the Asian Pacific Development Center. She is also the policy director of Colorado 6. And Noreen received the Outstanding Student Voice Award from CU Boulder in 2015 and has interned at the White House Initiative on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders and the United States Equal Opportunity Commission. So thank you, Noreen, for being here. It also happens to be her graduation day. So thank you for joining us on this auspicious day. All right, next I will introduce Lawrence Minh-Bui Davis, PhD. So Lawrence is based in Washington, DC as the curator of the Asian Pacific American Studies at the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center. He also oversees the Smithsonian Literature and Museum Initiative and serves as lead organizer for the Asian American Literature Festival. Furthermore, he is the founding director of the arts anti-profit, the Asian American Literary Review. So thank you, Lawrence, for being here with us today. Next, I'm happy to introduce Joie. Joie is an activist and community organizer in Colorado. She is the founder of Community Organizing for Radical Empathy and currently works as a partnership specialist for the US Census Bureau. She also serves as vice chair for the Denver Asian American Pacific Islander Commission. Thanks for being here with us, Joie. And last but certainly not least, I have Riaz Gia Sadine. Riyaz is the Vice President of Program and Talent with Camelback Ventures, which is an organization that increases access to opportunity for BIPOC and women entrepreneurs by investing in their ventures and leadership. He cherishes his Asian American identity and his journey to continuously better understand and live into the hyphen between Asian and American. Thank you so much, Riyaz, for being here with us today. And then I will introduce Kimberly in more detail later on when she closes our event with the spoken word performance, but we're very honored to have Kimberly here with us as well. So please stay tuned for her spoken word performance at the end of this panel. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it over to Kai Hamilton, another alumni co-chair. And he will give a brief background on Chinook Fund and the Giving Project, just for those of us who might be here at this event wondering who Chinook Fund is and what we do. So thank you so much, Kai. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jess, and hello, everyone. So Chinook Fund supports grassroots organizations working on issues of social and economic justice. By pooling our collective resources, we seed groups making a positive, systemic impact to improve the quality of life for all Coloradans. And our Giving Project goals are to move significant money to social justice organizing in Colorado, build community, educate ourselves about the current challenges and potential of social justice organizing around these issues through an anti-racist lens, develop our skills as donor organizers, and create a sustainable new model of funding critical underfunded social change work. Yes, and if you were considering joining a national movement for change, we have giving projects all across the country in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Minneapolis, Chicago, Seattle, Portland, Denver, Honolulu, Detroit, and North Carolina.
Hi, so I know you. Hi, I'm Brian, by the way. My pronouns are he, him. And before we jump into the panel, we just wanted to give a brief overview of the history of API folks in the U.S. As you can see, there is we've been around for quite some time in the country, and the first Asian American came in the 1700s. I'm not going to go through everything here, but as you know, there's been a lot of wins and setbacks for us. Obviously, it seems like the internment of the Japanese during World War II, exclusionary measures that were enacted towards Asians, like making, like painting Asians as the others. We really wanted to dive into all the complexities, the traumas, the problems we really need to unpack. And so just like going over that, setting the stage, and then really using that to understand where we go from now. Obviously, there's been a lot of wins on the way. You can see on the right and left prominent Asians, and of course today we have an Asian American woman as a vice president. So since a number of us call Denver and Colorado home, before we jump into the panel, we want to highlight something that is important and was a pretty traumatic event here in Denver. So for those of you that don't know, there used to be a Chinatown right here in the heart of downtown Denver, just a few blocks away from Union Station, and there were 3,000 Chinese in Denver at the beginning of the 20th century. But on October 31st, 1880, there was a race riot that took place in Denver, and as a result, Chinatown was ransacked and burnt down just blocks away from right in the heart of downtown. So if you go there today, there's very little trace of Chinatown left other than a plaque commemorating the race riots on 20th and Blake. So we want to highlight that important piece of history here in Denver. And with that out of the way, let's get started with the panel discussion. We're very excited and honored to have such a group of very talented people spending time with us today and really helping us understand the AAPI community here in Colorado and beyond, and really unpacking very important things about our community. As you know, in the past year, there's been a lot of things about this coronavirus and how that has impacted the AAPI community and also the events in Atlanta. We intentionally do not want to dwell on those because we know that it's been a lot to deal with, and there's been plenty of discussion around this. So we wanted to go into more nuanced discussion for this. So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and open it up to a panel so we can just unpack things a little bit more. So as we all know, the history of Asian Americans is certainly a complex one. Let's start off by talking about the concept of yellow peril and the and model minority and how those have impacted the community. I also want to try for us to talk about the impact of militarism and Western imperialism and how that's impacted API folks. So if anyone wants to kick us off.
I can go ahead and start. So, that's a really good question. And thank you for giving that history of Asian American history here. So, yellow peril has existed since the first Chinese laborers set foot on this land. It continued into immigration laws. It continued into World War II. It continued into, I would even consider post 9/11 as well. But one really interesting thing that a lot of people don't recognize is that the birth of the model minority myth in the 1950s and 60s was really used as a racial weapon against the civil rights movement, painting Asian Americans as successful, and the model minority was really used as a dig against Black Americans here, and to show them in a US propaganda way that anybody can make it regardless of systemic racism. So one thing that I always want to stress is whenever we're talking about model minority and yellow peril is that they're really two sides of the same coin. And that is something that a lot of people don't recognize. We always think of model minority as a very successful term, even though it's actually clouded in anti-Asianness, anti-people of color. And it really spoke to the way that US government viewed minorities. So that's one thing I did want to stress when we're talking about model minority myth is it's not positive for Black Americans or for Asians too. Asian Americans, due to the model minority myth, and especially when we're speaking in the context of the pandemic, suffer a lot because of it too. We as a community are less likely to seek healthcare, to ask for help when we need it because of this myth and the way it exists. Yeah, I'll let another panelist speak on it a little bit more, but that's something I wanted to stress too.
I'm happy to chime in a little bit. This is Lawrence. I'll quickly say I'm zooming in from Piscataway land in Maryland, just outside of DC. I think I would add to that. I think is a really helpful recap from Noreen. Thank you. Part of establishing the model minority myth was also selective acceptance and migration patterns, often referred to as brain drain, where Asian immigrants allowed into the country during certain periods it was very classed. Only those with high education able to immediately contribute and slot into certain kinds of jobs. And so that helped kind of shore up this idea of a model minority and expectations around education and class and wealth and contributions to society. And it's also really served to, this is a kind of troubling thing across communities when we talk about model minority myth, is that we often trot out those who don't fit into the myth, those that are left out of it, and the kind of need for disaggregation of data, and to say, okay, well, if we have high achieving X, Y, and Z communities in these regions, what about, say, refugee populations? And we frequently trot out either really new arriving communities, or we trot out Southeast Asian communities that have like really high incarceration rates, really low rates in terms of education, which is often like a kind of punch to the gut to Southeast Asian communities who are like, it's not great for us to be like the way to prove the lie of the model minority myth, even as we're trying to do helpful work. But it is important to recognize those kind of disparities. I want to throw out, or make sure to mention, when it comes to the model minority myth, the importance of thinking about it as a myth that has a lot of truth to it, in the sense of the bearing that it has on our communities and the ways in which Asian Americans have historically bought into respectability, and the kind of seductiveness and the power of white aspirationalism that runs across many communities, but has been particularly strong when we talk about the model minority myth, and continues to be strong in Asian American communities. And we have to understand that that's how imperialism works. That's how colonization works. What it asks of colonial subjects, even as we see that, being high earning and having being, contributing to American society and the American story doesn't prevent anti-Asian violence. It doesn't prevent violence against any community. Following the rules of a broken system doesn't exempt you from the brokenness of the system. We know that America is a country that is predicated, has always been predicated, and continues to be predicated on exploitation and racism. And buying into that and being a good citizen doesn't exempt you from that racism. It requires you to replicate it and participate in it. And it still positions you on the receiving end of that, which is what Asian American history and Pacific Islander history have continually shown us, and show us in kind of magnified fashion during the pandemic.
I appreciate Noreen for kind of starting us off, and Lawrence for lifting how damaging the model minority myth is for many Asian American Pacific Islander communities when data is not disaggregated. I think we've seen that a lot, especially with some newer immigrants that have come to this country that may not have the means as some of the, especially during immigration when it was lifted in the 60s and 70s, where you had a wave of more of the high degree medicine sort of immigrants come in, and that's not always the case with all Asian Americans or Asians who immigrate to this country. And I also think like this idea of the model minority myth is was created by white supremacist culture and by white people to pit us against Black brothers and sisters. And I think if we buy into that, I think there's this idea that white people give us a pass at times. So I feel like I describe it as being under the radar at times. Like we can fly underneath the radar as being Asian American. And when they want us, white people, they'll use us to say, hey, we have diversity, look at this, like X, Y, Z. But when we're about to reach, and what some people call the bamboo ceiling and want to break through, they're like, whoa, you can't do that. And if you look at our Fortune 500 companies, if you look at middle management, there's, I actually don't know the percentage of middle management that are Asian, but if you look at CEOs, only 2% of all CEOs in Fortune 500 companies identify as Asian. And I think that just, to me, demonstrates how damaging the model minority myth is, and how folks who buy into it at certain times of your life or certain points, white people will praise you. But at the end of the day, they're still controlling how we exist. And I think at times we don't know, it's important to, I think, see that bigger picture.
Thanks, Riaz. And I think those are just really wonderful points made by everyone. And I really want to emphasize this common thread that at times Asian Americans will buy into this model minority myth because in a way it makes them feel like they've made it, they're closer to whiteness in a certain extent. However, it's important to note that given the opportunity and when needed, white supremacy and white supremacy culture will throw you under the bus. No matter what, you're not white, period. You will never be white, period. And then maybe they'll throw you a bone and say, maybe you're better than the other minorities. But it's never in a sense where they're trying to uplift our community. And it's really important to remember that. Some other things to mention, and data disaggregation was mentioned a few times, is the importance of looking at data beyond Asian American or Asian American Pacific Islander altogether. When you sort of break things down, you can see there are huge disparities just within our communities. In the Asian American community, as compared to other racial and ethnic groups, we have the largest wealth gap. We also have the largest rate of increase of the wealth gap. In New York City in 2019, 24% of Asian Americans were in poverty, which was the highest amount of all racial and ethnic groups at that time. And it's important to note that these types of numbers are very detrimental to the community, because when you think about it, all of our incoming refugees, a big part of them are from these Asian countries. We have a lot of folks from places like Myanmar. And when you look at the data and you look at the overall data where it says Asians as a whole have higher educational attainment, then resources aren't getting to these communities that need them. They're being overlooked because people are looking at the general average of the data and saying, hey, Asians are doing just fine. They don't need any funding for education. They don't need any funding for refugee resettlement, but that's not the case. So it's really important when looking at the model minority myth to realize that it is one, untrue, and only applies in like very specific cases to one or two populations in any ways.
Yeah, and I think everybody has raised such good points. It's going to be hard for me to follow up on all of your excellent points. And, you know, I work a lot with the immigrant and refugee communities in Colorado. And one of the side effects of the model minority myth is that our communities are often invisible. So, you know, in a lot of reports regarding police brutality or homelessness or drug use, usually there is hardly any statistic regarding Asian community. And so as a direct service provider, it's a challenge for me to allocate resources or to even know which community needs assistance right now, because we just simply don't have that data. And I know that some states like California and New York are kind of trying to do more of that disaggregation. In Colorado, when we work with the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment trying to get those data, what we found out very early on was simply that the data was never collected in the first place. Like if ethnicity was collected in the beginning, it's often very broad, just one category, Asian. So then the data just becomes an average, like what Joie mentioned. So then it really, you know, the lows are being hidden by the highs because then everything just averages out. And that's a challenge for our community.
Before we move on to another question, I wanted to throw out one thing or circle back to Brian's point about militarism and Western imperialism, because I think I know several of us have some thoughts on that, and so it feels important to engage too. I was trying to look for the link, but I can't find it, but I'll drop the name of the writer in the chat. He's a scholar at Brown. He wrote this great article. Mark Sang Putterman wrote this great article recently about rethinking waves of anti-Asian violence in the context of American imperialism, thinking about wars in Asia abroad. It begins with like this awful story about the brutal murder of a Vietnamese refugee woman and by a former vet, and like to bring home the point that like when we have wars in Asia, which we have throughout the 20th century, and then refugees from those countries come to the US, the sentiment that existed throughout those wars doesn't suddenly evaporate when Asians arrive in this country. And the relations that are caused by US military bases all throughout Asia historically, those aren't like somehow over there and don't have any real bearing or impact on Asian bodies, both in Asia and in the US. And so it's really important to think about anti-Asian violence in the context of a kind of larger national imaginary that has for a very long time pictured Asian women's bodies in particular in a certain way, which makes the murders in Georgia possible. And that's inseparable, and that we can't forget about those legacies, that it's really important to think about those legacies and how we conceive on a kind of representational level of Asian bodies, and that we have kind of larger responsibilities to shift those narratives over time and to reckon with those histories, as opposed to pretending that they're not there and that acts of violence are maybe, you know, singular mental health lapses, as opposed to a product of large scale trans-historical conditioning about how the US should think about or position itself in terms of Asia.
Lawrence, I think that's a really great point, and I really liked how you drew connections between Western imperialism and exactly what happened in Georgia. I think it's really important to note in Western imperialism, when forces have consistently occupied those countries, a lot of times, a lot of these soldiers there at that time raped a lot of the women, right? So you end up having, in several cases, a mass rape. And you also see in a lot of media the idea that Asian women are these bodies to be conquered, and Asian women are also made to serve the white man. And that directly relates to what happened in Atlanta, because there was the stereotype that Asian woman existed for that man's sexual pleasure. And because he wanted to, in a way, get rid of his temptations, that is why he targeted them. It's important to remember how what happens abroad does have impacts here, and it does impact how people see Asian women as these bodies to be had, these bodies to be conquered, these people that exist to serve.
Well, thanks everyone for providing all that context. This is a very important conversation, and adding on to the subject of violence, you know, we've just been this tension with the police and like the constant push and pull for the need for law enforcement, while also acknowledging the negative impacts on the community. At times as a community, as AAPI people, we kind of like brought down by the model minority stereotype we had to deal with. How, and there's also a generational gap. How do we address that when it comes specifically to the views on policing?
I think we're all silent because I don't, I mean, I could be wrong because all of you are smarter than me, but I don't have a good answer to this. I mean, that's one of the challenges that we face on a daily basis, because as one of the few direct service providers, we get feedbacks and requests from a lot of people within the community. And like you said, Brian, there's definitely a generational divide. And, certain segments of our community wants more funding for law enforcement. They want more foot patrol. They want increase, neighborhood patrol. And then other segments say we do not want more funding. It has to be more of a community-led solutions. So, I mean, it's kind of part of the work we have to do, is we have to walk this line between our communities, because some of the people that have been asking for the increased law enforcement have been direct victims themselves. And I don't want to invalidate their experience or what they went through. But at the same time, I'm also cognizant of the fact that the police has done harms to our community. So that's kind of the challenge we're all facing. And I would certainly love to hear what the rest of you think about that.
Yeah, this is a really good question. And when I hear this question, I'm reminded of the shooting of Akai Gurley, the 28-year-old in Brooklyn, who was shot by Officer Peter Liang in 2014 or 2015. And there were so many Asian Americans who started to categorize that incident and, paint Liang as a scapegoat by saying 1 bullet, 2 victims. And that was a messaging that a lot of these Asian Americans had at rallies in support of Officer Liang during that. And I think it was really a prime example of a generational gap when it came to this idea of policing. And especially for our community, it was difficult for many to understand that we can really either fight for special treatment of Asian Americans in a racially unjust system, or we can work with other communities of color to challenge that system. And that was a question that many were asking during that time and since forward too. So I want to stress that while there were these, rallies, big Asian rallies in support of Officer Liang, there was also young folks on the ground in support of Black folks during that time too, Asian Americans standing in solidarity with the Black community during that time. And so that's something that I don't think gets highlighted a lot, but I do think that is where our movement is headed, especially with young folks. And so I also want to stress that an important piece of this equation is also in the fact that a lot of Asian communities see policing as a Black issue, and they remain apathetic to it because it doesn't, in their minds, they think that it doesn't impact them. So one thing I have found particularly useful, especially in dealing with communities that I work with that are very pro-police, very pro-law enforcement, is that one, this is an Asian issue, and two, it really doesn't matter if it doesn't impact them directly because there's something bigger at play. So I remind people all the time of what happened to Suresh Bhai Patel in 2015, who was left half paralyzed post 9/11 because he was beaten up by a police officer. And a lot of people, a lot of Desis don't recognize that this impacts our community too. And so we have to, remain in solidarity with other communities of color, because once again, as we've learned throughout Asian American history, even throughout US history, is that there is always a constant pitting of minority versus minority. And once we're able to break that down and understand that we have a lot of work that we can do together, that is when we're headed in towards a more better system, a more just America, and towards liberation.
Yeah, I mean, it is a very difficult question, and Harry, Noreen, appreciate your insights. And I think kind of the Desi grandfather that Noreen is referring to is called on because he was suspicious in a neighborhood he was living in. And how, if we're not able to see that correlation of how that happens to Black communities in this country, I think we're missing the point. And the system is working as it should be right now. It is damaging Black and Brown communities. And I think that this idea of policing, I think we have to recognize that it's not working. And it is disproportionately affecting certain communities. And as Asian American Pacific Islander communities, knowing that we do identify as BIPOC or Black, Indigenous people of color, we are a part of that. And if we're not standing in solidarity, especially with our Black brothers and sisters, we're contributing to the problem as well. And I don't have a great answer. I do think that we should be moving into more of community-based decisions in terms of how the community, and I know that's such a large and vague term, but how certain neighborhoods and communities want to be served. And I think that is something that needs to happen. And as Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, it's important for us to have our voices at that table to be there, and also to stand in solidarity with our Black brothers and sisters.
I would throw out the possibilities of transformative justice as a model, which grows out of kind of solidarity, cross-racial spaces. And, as we're calling for abolition and as we're calling for attention to policing and police brutality, I think the need to not that we need to replace protests with solutions always, but that the recognition that it takes time when we're asking, especially older folks, to set aside policing in favor of other possibilities, and we say community-based models. I think it's beginning the work of distributing and growing familiarity with transformative justice models, even as they must adapt and aren't ready yet for prime time everywhere, and it's not one size fits all solutions. I mean, we see disability justice and transformative justice rooted in disability justice taking hold across the academy. I think we see it like access practices shifting all over the place. And I think with time, but with intentional encouragement, we can hopefully grow transformative justice as something that people begin to be familiar with as alternatives for conflict resolution and for addressing really complicated, difficult situations in ways that not only don't require police, but produce outcomes that everyone can feel better about. I think building support for that takes time and education work. And I think that's where we call upon a broader public to help do that kind of awareness raising and that kind of work to bring especially when we think of older generations who have different kinds of access to information and different kinds of access to community building, when we help invite them into those conversations in new ways.
Thanks, everyone. And I just want to mention in the chat, thanks, Brian and Joie, for highlighting also the generational gap with more conservative people, older people versus more liberal people in the younger generations. That's certainly also attributing, and the younger generations also understanding the nuances a little bit better than the oldest. So yeah, we got a lot of good questions. Other topics I want to move us along. So as you know, there's a multitude of ethnicities and countries of origin within the AAPI community, and oftentimes families are within a generation or two of immigrating to the US, with creating barriers to organizing and coming together as a community. How do we build bridges within our communities and between other communities? And how are we going to support each other, hold each other accountable, and welcome new activists into the fold?
I guess I can say something. I was hoping to build off what everyone else was saying, but I think this is also a tough question, right? Because there is no one answer. There's no one model that really fits for everyone, and building up our community. I think since we were talking about generational gaps earlier, I can talk about that a bit more too. When we're talking about some of the disconnects we have between the older generation and this generation, and sort of how that expresses itself in trying to build solidarity amongst all of us, right? We have some of the older generation being more conservative, and it's important to notice and understand why some of these things happen. And specifically, I want to talk a bit more about the Vietnamese American community, where you have the older Vietnamese folks that did come here at the peak of the Vietnam War or after the fall of Saigon. And their experiences with communism were, of course, very terrible. People were losing their homes, their families, their lives to the communist regime that had taken over. And as a result, you have a lot of the older Vietnamese American folks that are very conservative, and any thing that to them seems a bit left-leaning, it automatically falls into this bucket of communism and therefore must be fought against. So you do have a lot of Vietnamese Americans who are very conservative in that sense, very supportive of some policies that are hurtful to the community as a whole because of their historic experience. And I think one of the ways to sort of bridge this gap, well, I mean, I don't understand, I don't know what the answer is necessarily, but I think being able to continually connect with this older generation and to listen to their fears and to sort of talk about how their fears are valid, but also how they differ from what is going on in America right now. And also noting that Western imperialism was a big cause of the Vietnam War. What had happened in that Southeast Asian area, the destabilization of that region was because of Western imperialism. And I think one of the things that we can definitely do is just try to listen to each other more and try to educate our elder generation on those particular topics. Though, I mean, I think that in itself has many different ways of doing it, different methods. There is no one method that would work for everyone.
Maybe we're all quiet because this is such a hard question. I feel like the first thing I thought of is like aunts and uncles that I've written off and don't talk to anymore because they say horrible things. And I think I would venture to say many of us in this Zoom room have had similar experiences. And so it's really hard to say, how do we call them in? How do we build bridges to them when we're thinking about like people that have lit those bridges on fire, or maybe we've lit those bridges on fire ourselves in like online flame wars, arguing about like, you know, some of the events of the last year or two. It's a really hard question. And I don't think there are solid solutions. I think, you know, it's important to do the kind of work that Joie and Noreen mentioned of like understanding where, say, supporters for Peter Liang are coming from. And even as we don't agree with it and we take great issue with it, it's like, and maybe need to create space from it at times and set boundaries for our own mental health within families, say, to when we can, to try and understand where it's coming from, because that is a kind of important pathway to engaging it and dealing with it, understanding what those motivations are, or what kind of investments the more conservative members of our community are making, like why they're acting out of fear, why white aspirationalism is so powerful to them, why anti-communism leads to, you know, virulent anti-queer. I mean, there's not like a direct line, but like those are two things that are also very like prevalent in Vietnamese American community. Besides being anti-communist, the first generation tends to be just massively queer-phobic and transphobic, and trying to understand where that comes from, even if that doesn't automatically get us to, okay, we have to have these kinds of programs or do this kind of community work to engage that. It's not clear what the answer is, but at least beginning with some of that understanding feels important to me.
I guess I can go again, since there are two aspects to the question. And the second aspect is, how do we develop more activists and include more folks into the fold? As our community grows, I think there are more and more activists that are cropping up and they're getting interested, right? And it's sad to say, but when our community is under attack, that's when you see more people interested in getting involved. But I think it is important for community leaders to actively welcome these new folks into the fold, and also understanding that maybe they don't have everything that they need to be this perfect activist just yet, and they need some support. So I think it's really important for our community to always be supporting young activists and being very cognizant of what the difference between calling in and calling out is. Calling in as a way to say, hey, I saw that you said this particular thing. Can we talk about it? I feel like some of it is problematic, and I would love to support your journey and help your understanding, as opposed to calling out and putting them on blast on social media or in public or any particular places, which discourages their interest in getting involved or their growth. So I think something that all around in terms of Asian American activists will have to be more cognizant of is that there are going to be a lot of more folks interested in getting involved. And it's important that we make space for these folks to come in instead of gatekeep what is or isn't appropriate activism.
One thing I want to touch on, you know, kind of think about these multi-generations, you know, I think about, you know, I can speak to my own experience and may resonate with other folks who identify as South Asian or Desi. You know, my parents came to this country with little to nothing. And their main goal was to make a better life for their children and other generations. And, you know, I think even the tension that I have with some of the older generation, I also have to reflect on, I don't have to deal with that as much as they did in terms of surviving. They laid groundwork for me where I am now able to have a safety net. You know, fortunately, I know that's not for everyone. And I can concentrate on thinking about solidarity with others. And I think that took me some time to come to a realization of that, and not just keep fighting back with my parents or the older generation, as they didn't have that luxury. And I also think that's important to think about and recognize that I do have that luxury to create my own path, to chart my own journey, you know, because there is a groundwork that has been laid for me, and I recognize that now, and I don't think I recognized that when I was younger. And that's been some conversation that I think has allowed me to come to peace with knowing that there's a great need to be able to understand the history and perspectives of older generations, to know that this is why I'm here today.
All great points being made. Thanks again. So I think one thing that we all wanted to touch on is on the point that as a whole AAPI community, we aren't a monolith. Right? I know that the majority of us in this space have a progressive leaning, but of course there are AAPI folks that voted for Trump. Back to Proud Boys is prominent figures like Michelle Malkin, Helen Raleigh in Colorado. So how do we reconcile that? And also I wanted us to talk about how do we reconcile, since some of us are so very tied to our ethnicities, how do we lean into those while also leaning into the Pan-Asian movement here in the US?
You know, Brian, I think that's another good question. And I'm going to piggyback on what Joie actually mentioned in her answer to the last questions about we are seeing a lot more leaders coming into the field right now. You know, both young, old, first generation, third generation, fifth generation, everybody coming in. And, you know, it's both good in that we have a lot more players on the field, but it's also very challenging because some of these leaders, they may not have the same understanding that we do, in which case we are obviously happy to work and help people. But then there are also actively toxic people that will do harm to the community, right? You know, like people like Michelle Malkin, there's no way in hell I am working with her. I mean, I am not working with like a neo-Nazi fascist person. I mean, there's just no compromise in that field, right? I mean, like how do I compromise against somebody that just wants to harm people and so far off like that? So I think that yes, we want to work with everybody, but you know, when you have like fascist wings like that of the community, yeah, we will basically excise those as much as possible.
Kind of going off of what Harry said, I think a lot of these spaces are very attractive for men of any ethnic background due to toxic masculinity. And I think that's why you see a lot of, you know, Asian American, primarily men, that attend, you know, Proud Boys things or support candidates that, you know, spew racist and harmful rhetoric. So one thing I also want to stress, and I think it does play a part here, not as much with our older generation, but I do want to kind of bring up the point of social media and the way that it can create these spaces in which people, you know, fall into and are surrounded by this type of use. Algorithms and the way social media is designed is designed to show users what they want to see, not necessarily what they need to see. So whether it's on WhatsApp or WeChat or whatever it might be that we find our communities using, they could find themselves in spaces that are surrounded by really harmful rhetoric, and they may not even recognize it. I'm not saying that a lot of the times they do recognize it. I'm saying for some of them, they may not even be recognized that they're in this kind of vacuum of thought. So one of the ways that I found to be really instrumental in the ways of talking about and challenging back is it kind of starts at home. One thing we have to recognize as Asian Americans is that anti-Blackness runs really pervasive throughout our community. And if we're not willing to talk about it at home, how are we going to expect to talk about it in outside circles? So for me, it starts at home. The way you talk about your older generation in terms of issues about race, that's a really important first step to take. And it's often the hardest one to do. But I do think it sets a really good precedent if you're really wanting to make good change that is meant in solidarity with others. Starting at home is a good place. And recognizing that talking about social media, even in like the bigger context, is also a really good, important way. And I think this country is starting to do a little more discussions on that as well.
All right, well, this has been such a great conversation. Unless anyone else has something else to add on, I just want to ask one more question. Any closing thoughts? Anything you want to add before we close out the panel portion of the event? I just want to ask, how do we go forward as in a API community? How do we best support, show solidarity, build coalitions with other people of color, women, and other marginalized communities? And it's been a tough year, really tough year for especially people of color. How do we keep the work that we're doing, the movement we're trying to build, and making sure that it produces meaningful change? And again, if you guys have any other closing thoughts, I think we have about 10 minutes left.
Thanks, Brian, and thanks everyone for having us here. I really enjoyed the conversation we've had today. I think it's important for all of us to realize that true activism, true allyship, it is a journey. It's not a destination. There has to be constant unlearning, constant relearning, and just constant work being done, because there are so many injustices in the world, right? So it's not sort of you host a rally and you're done. You don't have one workshop and you're done, right? You have to be doing this work constantly. And it's incredibly important for us to stand in solidarity with our other BIPOC siblings. It's important for us to stand in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, with the Free Palestine movement, with a lot of things that have been going on, because our liberations are all tied. We cannot liberate just one community. That's not how it works. Our liberations are all tied. And the system that keeps us down also keeps down our Black siblings, our Indigenous siblings, our Latinx, LGBTQ, etc. siblings. And so as a result, it's important to note that you can't only advocate for your community, because unfortunately, the real work that needs to be done is as a collective working with all marginalized communities for equality and for equity. So I think thanks again for everyone having us. And I really encourage folks to stay in this sphere as much as you can. Of course, take time when you need it to rest up, but make sure that you are keeping knowledge about things going on and checking up on each other and making sure that we are all supported in this really lifelong battle.
I want to add one more thing to that. I think Joie said it perfectly. One thing I want to add is recognizing privilege when you have it. I think a lot of times, especially in this country, as Asian Americans, we think that we're always on the receiving end of oppression and tactics used, and that's true. But for a lot of folks back in their ancestor homes, they have immense privilege. And so, some examples of that is what's going on with farmers in India, what's going on in West Asia. We always see there's this pitting of even Asians against Asians in certain spaces, and it looks different here in the West versus what it may look like back home. So I think a really good conversation to start is recognizing where you have privilege, where is it hurting? Who is it hurting? And how can you use it to amplify but not distract from movements? So for example, Asian lives matter. We shouldn't be using terms like that, right? So recognizing like, how do we amplify the Black Lives Matter movement, but also calling to attention what's going on with Asians and not taking away from that as well. That's always an important discussion to have too in spaces.
No, Joie was touching on this when she was sharing, and I think both Noreen and Joie shared a lot of things that I don't have much more to add. You both said it very well. But that this is a journey, and I think working in solidarity and working for equity looks different for everyone. And I think that there's not one size fits all of activism, if you will, for everyone. It's not everyone's cup of tea to be on the street. To be protesting. There's a lot of work that you can do, and you don't have to always be on the street, on the ground. There are different ways of advocating, giving your time, your money, your knowledge can be done in many different ways, and can also be done through a computer, through a phone. It doesn't have to be in person. And so I do think that even the smallest acts can be big ones, and it doesn't have to be something that is very performative, if you will, but that, don't be afraid just because you don't know where to go. I mean, little things can always add up and be helpful.
I think my closing thought is that, Brian, you mentioned early on about the great diversity within the Asian community. And, we have to constantly push back on that monolithic framing of our community. So it's important that when, right now it's Asian Heritage Month. So every reporter loves doing stories about the Asian community. I think those of us that have the privilege of being one of the media contact also has the responsibility to try to introduce other leaders to the, other lesser known community, just so that all of our voices can be heard. Because otherwise, we don't want Asian to just be seen as basically East Asian, right? I mean, there's more than enough representation of Chinese, Japanese, Korean. Like, we need more of the Pacific Islanders, South Asian, Southeast Asian, West Asia. So we just have to make sure all of our voices are heard, and not just certain key people.
I guess I would add, coming from a curatorial Smithsonian context, thinking about the place of the arts as they overlap with some of the conversations that my wonderful co-panelists have mentioned. I think of the fact that, like, even before the pandemic, I think since the advent of 45's presidency, readerships across the country have been hugely up. And those numbers are specifically up in queer and BIPOC communities. And it's like the first time poetry readership has been up in like 50 years. People have been proclaiming poetry as dying and dead for a long time. And then suddenly we have more poetry being read than ever before. And that matters. And I think about like the Poetry Foundation, the largest institution devoted to poetry in the country, and the massive public protests against it over the last year, specifically that it shift its board and its presidency and its editorship to not be predominantly white, and to engage communities of color, and to support Black Lives Matter, to think about how it has drawn upon and exploited poets of color in the Chicago community, but also nationally, and to shift its function as an arts provider to play a role in social justice directly. And I think that's so important. I think, that's work that's trying to happen at the Smithsonian. I think it's work that we have to demand of our larger arts institutions, because representation is so important. And because we think about the role that arts and representational work, like in the chat, we're asking about, kids' books, like the role that education plays and in shifting our educational system to orient itself towards the kinds of justice we want and need. And that takes organizing labor, that takes artists and creators and curators working in lockstep with organizing communities. It takes kind of long-term planning and recognizing the ways in which we need to and can bend our arts institutions and educational institutions to reflect the needs of our times. I think about the Third World Liberation Front strikes 50 years ago, and the creation of women's studies, indigenous studies, Chicanx studies, Asian American studies, Black studies, like those came with concerted protest, and they have paid real dividends, even if there are flaws and problems with those histories too. And so I think we have to continue to push for those kinds of changes in our educational system, because they have such long-term effects on the young people who go through those systems. And so we think about the work that happens in the streets and in our communities, and that is where it starts, and that is the crucial work. And like I feel like it's also our responsibilities to continue connecting that work to classrooms and connecting it to museum and public art spaces that have to be accountable to the organizing work that's happening in the streets.
Thanks. Well, thank you all so much, panelists. This has been a great conversation. And yeah, now we're going to open it up if the rest of you want to turn on your cameras. I think we have about 10 minutes for Q&A. Thanks, Ty, for kicking us off in the chat and about book and podcast recommendations. Okay, so I see in the chat from Franklin, who are American-based API leaders to work at currently for this week?
Hi, Franklin. So not exactly leaders, but some organizations I highly recommend folks to follow would be Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, APIA Vote, and then Empowering Pacific Islander Communities are the ones that I can think of off the top of my head, and I'll drop them in the chat.
Any other questions out there? Anything else that the panelists would like to bring up? Oh, I see one more. Are there any translation services you are all able to recommend?
I'm typing it into the chat about the translation services.
I have a question for the leaders on this panel, just because there are so many incredible ones here with us today. I really appreciate the deep historical context and intra-community political analysis you provided. And as someone who grew up in an immigrant family, in an immigrant community that was very Korean focused, I would love to hear how you all developed or were invited into a broader political analysis around Asian American Pacific Islander identity. Because from my own experience, I feel like many times we're very enclaved in our specific ethnic identities and communities. And cross-racial community for me has happened primarily in a political context. So I'm curious, like, what all invited you all to see things a bit differently? What were your steps into having a bigger analysis and orientation to the work? Because I think that can be really insightful for some of the questions we are holding around how we move forward and build activists.
This is a really good question. So I actually didn't really consider myself Asian until college. Whenever people would ask what my most salient identities were, it was always based on my faith or Desi or South Asian, but I never really considered it to be Asian. It wasn't until college, right when I was entering college, that the Oak Creek shooting in Wisconsin happened, and we had a vigil here. And I remember a lot of my Asian friends, they came and they stood by, and one of them said the comment, like, it's important that Asians show up in solidarity to those events. And I remember thinking in my head, like, oh, am I Asian? That was really the first time that it really clicked for me. And the reason why it happened is because I had people showing up in solidarity for my grieving community at the time. And that's what really brought me into the fold of the work, is because people showed up for me in a time when I needed it the most. And that's what really brought me into the fold. And I know, like, times of tragedy can mean a lot of different things for a lot of different people. But I do think in times of tragedy, I think we're showing up for people in the ways that they would like to be shown up to is a really important way to bring people into the work and show, like, the inclusivity and the importance of showing up in solidarity, whether it's cross Asia or cross racial lines too.
No, for me, I grew up in a predominantly white society in North Dakota, one of only a handful of people of color in the community I lived in. And because of that, I know that I felt more white than anything growing up and didn't really have a feel of the identity. And it wasn't until I was an educator, that's where I started my career in West Baltimore, that I started to recognize that I am a person of color and what it means to be Asian American. And I think it was from the other teachers, my students who I taught, where I really started to understand inequity and this idea of being in solidarity with communities of color. And I think kind of like what Noreen was saying in terms of how tragedy sometimes really accelerates one's own identity development. I know for me, what really kind of sparked my own work in terms of understanding who I was, my own history, but also being in solidarity was the events in 2015 when Freddie Gray was murdered in Baltimore, which is where, at that time was living for 7 years. And the uprisings happened, 2 miles away from where I was living. And many of my students were a part of that. And I think that was a political awakening for me and really did start to mobilize me to say, I have to do better and I have to, unlearn many things, but also have a lot to learn as well.
Yeah, I'm trying to think how to answer that question. Because that's an excellent question about the concept of identity. I'm an immigrant. I came here from Indonesia. I had to kind of construct my own identity. Because my parents immigrated from China to Indonesia. So the native Indonesian community does not welcome us or does not accept the Chinese community. That's why you see my last name, Budisidharta. That's not my real last name. That's the last name that the Indonesian government forced on my family, because the Indonesian government back in the 60s or 50s, their idea of assimilation was you will change your name. You will not you will not have a Chinese language school. You will not practice your Chinese New Year. So you all will have the same culture and religion no matter what. Now, and then what happens is that when we travel to China, we kind of stuck out because I don't speak Mandarin. Some of the customs are a little bit unfamiliar to me because my parents don't practice it, or because my community were not allowed to practice it. So as I get older and I became more active in the community, that's where I naturally gravitate toward more of that Pan-Asian kind of identity, because that's, in a way, it's kind of like one of the few options I have left, right? I mean, the Indonesians don't really welcome me. The Chinese community looks at me kind of weird. So the Pan-Asian identity is what I grapple, it's kind of like what I gravitate into. So that's a tricky one for me to answer, but that's a good question.
All right, I'm jumping back in just to check in. Is there anything else that our panelists would like to add before we turn it over to our spoken word performance to begin closing the event? And I guess not. So thank you everyone so much. What a rich, wonderful conversation. We're so grateful to have you here with us today. And I'm very excited to be introducing Kimberly Ming, who will be closing out our event with a spoken word performance. So Kimberly is the founder of the MixdGen podcast, inspired by her own experience as a multicultural Chinese and Puerto Rican woman. She was nominated for a regional Emmy Award in 2018 for her work as a writer and performer on the #CelebrateHumanity campaign with 9 News. We're very honored to have her here with us this afternoon, so please help me welcome Kimberly. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. And I was honored to just be able to read some of my poems. And it was also really exciting to hear that perspective around poetry and art being fought for, because I definitely relate to poetry being almost a method to not only just activate my own voice, but in my experience, it's been activating for others. And that is what inspires me to write and to share. And so, yeah, I really related to this content and really appreciate all of the panelists and just grateful to share these poems. So I'm going to share 2 poems today. This one is actually called Model Minority, and it actually speaks a lot to what was being talked about regarding, the myth. And this was a very personal, I guess, me thinking through the model minority myth itself and how it affected me personally, and questioning this concept of how is it model? Like, how are we the model in the sense of the harm it causes? All right. Growing up, I learned that silence was the sound I was allowed to make, that invisible was the road to take. It's funny how they make certain lives seem more valuable than others, that they control my self-esteem, that there is even a they that I am referring to, yet still not really sure who's sitting at that table. As a table of decision makers and media image control, don't even know what the table looks like, if it's a round table or a long rectangle, a round table or a long rectangle, if it's made of cherry wood, maple, or glass. I don't know if there's a centerpiece in the middle, if there's wine for fine dine, if the food consists of steak or pasta. I wasn't at that table. I didn't even make it to the kitchen. I tried to cook bok choy and rice noodles, and they laughed at me, saying, American does not look like me. They call us model minority. Do you think my silence is pretty? Is my invisible easy for you to swallow? Convinced we are everything but majority. Even though we span across the world, Asians, you can find us everywhere. Our lives span across countries, ancient histories along the 7 seas. Our diversity is represented in our diverse looks. Despite we get told we all look the same. Many don't know the weight of pain's capacity, how at times we bury it deep, don't riot, taught to be quiet, silent. Do not talk about the internal bleed, the rates of suicide because of pain locked inside, the pain we are taught to hide. I learned over time, silence is actually a form of violence. Asian American women having higher rates of suicide. Growing up, I learned that silence was the sound I was allowed to make, that invisible was the road to take. But then I turned to my sisters, turned to the mothers, turned to the earth, turned to ancestors. I turned to myself, turned to books on the shelf, warrior lessons, Shanghai girls, sacred women. I regained mental health, see clarity in who I can be, finally mentally free and proud to be me. I learned that my voice could resonate. Self-worth was the path to take, and I am proud to awake. I am proud to awake to me, and no longer do I believe in my silence. Poem 1. Thank you all. I see some snaps in the chat. Thank you, thank you. And then this next poem I actually wrote is a recent write, and it was me thinking about the power of obviously recognizing the things that are happening in our society, but also thinking about dreaming and envisioning forward, which is something that always keeps me kind of on the path. And this is called In the World That I Dream. In the world that I dream, more peace circles are funded than violent machines. In the world that I dream, I assist to facilitate the belief that each one of us share one another's humanity. In the world that I dream, our differences enhance us instead of creating calamity, you see. In the world that I dream, we are rooted in our beliefs so much so it dissolves the hate in people's spirit, that see difference and anger covers up the truth so much that they fear it. Fear change, fear pain, fear things will not ever be the same system that has not served us all, the same system karma will cause to fall, the same system locks jaws and hearts up in concrete walls, the same system will not serve us all. So change is truth hard to face, deny it, deny Mother Nature's grace. We are erupting, uprooting the weeds. There is no I in we and me in team. And when we see that connection, let freedom ring. Because in the world that I dream, more peace circles are funded than violent machines. In the world that I dream, I assist to facilitate the belief that each one of us share each other's humanity. In the world that I dream, our differences enhance us instead of creating calamity, you see. In the world that I dream, I am you and you are me. Peace. Thank you all for having me.
Thank you so very much, Kimberly, for joining us today. So wonderful to be able to experience your performance, and yeah, thank you so much. Fantastic. All right. Well, I just want to close the event by just saying, finally, thank you to everyone who joined and took time out of their Saturday to be here today, especially our panelists and our spoken word performer, Kimberly. Thank you all so much. Thank you to Juliet from Chinook Fund for being the most lovely Zoom doula we could have imagined. Thank you to Brian for facilitating and moderating such an awesome panel. Thank you to Kai for all your help with everything getting ready for this event. And thank you to the alumni community for the Giving Project for, rallying, showing up, inviting your people. Thank you so much. We are so grateful. So we will be sending out a list to everyone who registered for this event of resources. I had a resource slide that I was ready to pop up, but we've, with the chat and everything, we've totally kind of overflowed that. So we're just gonna start fresh. We'll make a Google Doc. We'll have it all split up. There are certain bystander intervention training resources. There are certain self-defense resources. There are now historical resources, people to follow, all kinds, and art and spoken word and poetry recommendations as well. So we'll just compile a master list and we'll have that all sent out. So yeah, I think we'll end a few minutes early here, unless there's anything else anyone would like to say. But I think we're good. So thank you all so much. Have a wonderful rest of your weekend. And thank you for being here for this awesome panel event. Thank you all so much. We're very grateful. Have a great week.
Thank you.
It would be really sweet if, as folks left, they just kind of turn their videos on and wave goodbye, just so that this is recorded for posterity, all your amazing faces. Yeah, but feel free to dance your way out as you close.
Beautiful. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.